the sun. The blood dripped warm and salty from my nose to my mouth. It tasted like it was straight out of an old rusty pipe. I stood out front of my cabin, hurting, bleeding, surrounded by the misery of winter. I threw my head back and looked all around, above towards the fat golden dot in the cold winter sky, to the deep blue that stretched long without ever really ending, to the snow-tipped mountains, the high stacks of red-yellow buttes, and then back to the long, dusty floor of the earth. The only sound was the wind, everything big and eternal, and then me about to get swallowed up by it all. My heart throbbed in my temples, my eyes watered from the sting, and there wasn't a thing I could do about the pain. When I couldn't take it anymore, I fell to my knees and prayed for death. When my father died, he left me an old cabin in a small, dusty valley of a town whose blonde desert land ran long and flat. There couldn't have been a more fascinating contradiction in the land around me. To the north there were woods, and the woods gave way to a range of mountains that rose above the earth like pagan temples. I could ride my bike there and rest in the cool cover of the wilderness, or ride south and stand beneath the scattered desert monoliths, breathing the ancient dust of the earth. I moved into the cabin in the spring and started working at the lumber yard, but I mostly lived off my father's small life insurance policy. I couldn't have worked much anyway because a mold had ruined most of the lumber in our storage, and some new homes that we had contracted to had collapsed. The lumber company blamed it on the weather. Everyone else blamed it on the lumber yard. So I had a lot of time to ride and fish and think that spring, especially about what I was put on this earth to do and what kind of man I was destined to become. Night after night for months, I put on a Robert Johnson record, turn it up as loud as it could go, and lie down in the grass, listening, staring at the warm black sky like I was waiting for some kind of sign. Eventually, I started sleeping outside. It got so warm, and the cool blades of grass would tickle me into an uneasy sleep. I dreamed through a thin film of dust in front of my eyes, like an old cowboy, a real man, resting for a few hours before the sun came up, when I would pick up all my things and head someplace else where I could live out my days as a new man. The morning would come, though, and I'd always wake up where I fell asleep, with nowhere to go but inside. A man should look up at the sky and wonder, but not too often. I thought sometimes the empty, dark sky was going to make me cry, but I'd never let myself. No good could come from it. One day I walked west of my house to the small lake that was good for fishing and sitting. I had a bottle of whiskey on my right and the pole jammed into the rocks to my left. It was just like any other spring day, the wind on the water, the sky pressing on the clouds, the air warm and suspect. My pole stuttered and I yanked it. A baby slider turtle gulped on the hook. I took a slug of the whiskey, clipped the hook, and set the turtle beside me. I fed it some of the grub I was fishing with and sat it with me in silence until the sun fell to the west. I packed the turtle up with my gear and walked home. I couldn't figure out a good name for him, so I called him the turtle with no name. He was my only friend that spring, and that was fine by me. We waited through February and March, into the thaw of April, passing the time by listening to Robert Johnson and drinking whiskey. We didn't need to talk much, me and him. Together we didn't need to worry much either. And then one April day, I met a woman, the kind of woman a man would give everything to have. It had been a sunny day, but once the sun fell, the chill spread to the darkness. I'd ridden my bicycle so far that I had to stop at a bar for a water and a whiskey. I locked up my bike, checked the tires, made sure the brakes were tight, and stepped inside the bar. It would have been a normal night, except I saw her dancing exactly where I wanted to stand, and down shots without thinking. Her makeup gave her face a sweet glow, and everything, from her earrings to the lipstick to the lazy red curl above her left eye, was perfect. I wanted to run my fingers through her curly red hair, along her smooth, shiny back. I wanted to carry her out of the railroad saloon and make love to her in the fresh April air. But she was with a man, and I'm not the type of man to interfere with another man's relationship. I felt like I was passing through a town where I saw the woman of my dreams through a window, but had to keep moving. I walked a few spots away from her and ordered a whiskey. I drank and stared at my drink, sneaking glances at her and ignoring the people who bumped into me and yelled for drinks. After my third whiskey, a crash of broken bottles and overturned tables erupted over by her. I turned and had to duck from a flying bottle of beer that missed my nose by a horsefly. People screamed. The redhead's boyfriend and another man growled and rolled on the ground like animals. It was a good bar fight, hard punches, flying beer bottles, blood, chaos. The only thing missing was piano music. Quickly, though, the bouncers came over to pull them apart. One of the men was smiling. Her boyfriend was not that man. I drank my whiskey and left. I rode my bicycle home with the whiskey in my stomach and the wind in my face. I flew through the cool night, and there was nothing the night could do about it. The next week, I saw her alone at the bar. I stayed in the distance and looked away whenever she glanced in my direction. I pretended I was only there for the shot of whiskey that glowed amber brown in the glass in front of me. I think I almost hit you with a beer last week, a voice whispered behind me. I turned around. Her blue eyes looked back up at me from behind thick black eyelashes. She was perfectly still. She didn't blink, like she was in a photograph or a drawing or a wanted poster. I told her she missed. I'm sorry about that, she said. I nodded. I'm Bree, and you? I told her my name. I stammered I was sorry somebody beat up her boyfriend. I was sorry after the man was done, he wiped her boyfriend's blood all over his nice striped shirt. And if it had been my boyfriend, I would have jumped right in and stopped the beating. Rick. His name was Rick. But that as it was, I was just a man confused by the madness, a little drunk, and hardly accountable for another man's anger. I told her Rick probably loved having fists and hated the blues. She told me I was right. She told me a few things about Rick. He started fights all the time. He knew how to throw the first punch and always won. Rick would walk towards other people just to make them get out of the way. Rick rolled down his window and turned up his music in his car when he came to stoplights. Even Rick's friends didn't like him too much. She was kind of glad to see Rick get beat up. I wondered why she was with him in the first place, but I didn't want to ask her. I told her that any man with the name Rick deserved to get beat up. Why, she asked. I wasn't sure what I was talking about. I decided I needed to shut up. Words can betray a man. She laughed and pulled the stool over, looked up at me where I stood. I tried to keep calm. Do you go to school here? She asked. I told her no. What do you do? I told her I worked at the lumberyard. Do you like it? I'm sure I said no. Then why do you do it? I told her I wanted to see if I could do it. She looked confused. Have you ever been in love? I told her she asked too many questions. I'll take that as a no. She was correct. I think I was in love once. She thought about it. Fuck, I don't know. I didn't say anything. I had probably already said too much. I stared at the bar, remained calm. As a man, I think this is what you have to do sometimes. She cocked her head and looked at me. You don't say much, do you, pal? Then she turned off and started talking to her friends again. I gulped my whiskey, took a sip of my beer, and left. At home, I put on a Robert Johnson record and sat down beside the small glass aquarium. I picked up the turtle with no name and coaxed him out of his shell. I told him all about Robert Johnson, how he was a real man, and he wasn't afraid of the pain that comes with being a real man. We listened to Robert's tortured, lonely voice. Legend says he sold his soul to the devil in exchange for being able to play the blues. Legend says he died barking and foaming at the mouth. He sang of the yearning. He sang of chasing and of being chased. I told the turtle with no name about Bree and how she was going to help me become a man. He listened to my tale of love while I petted his leathery neck until it was time to go to bed. He looked happy when I set him back down in the aquarium. I turned the lights out and went outside to sleep. I started going to the railroad station quite a bit, looking for Bree. Often I wouldn't see her at all, and I would end up drinking and staring at nothing until the bar closed. But every so often I would pick the right time and she would be there, drinking and laughing and dancing like not a thing on this earth could shake her. The man-woman thing was damn peculiar, and I never really figured it out. Part of me wanted to simply watch her, to never get too close. But then I had already smelled her scent and almost touched her, and that was the part of me I couldn't control. Sometimes she would come talk to me, and we would have some sort of strange face-off until she left abruptly, or one of her friends pulled her away. Every time she smiled at me, it felt like a tree was growing inside my stomach, and it was going to burst through my skin and take root right where I was standing. With the help of a few whiskeys one night, I bought a bottle of beer. I always saw her drinking and brought it over to the table where she and her friends were sitting. I'm not sure what I said, or even how I got the courage or the stupidity to say it, but we sat down and drank and talked. We got to talking about our parents. Bree told me a man had robbed and killed her mother when she was 12. My mom had died giving birth to me, and my dad had been killed by a car when he was leaving the city when I was 9. We had a lot in common, sort of. I couldn't remember much to tell her about my dad. Mostly I remember the things that happened after he died. I went to his funeral. I went to the courts. I watched people sign important papers and look at me with pity. Perhaps I was too young to understand the things my dad tried to teach me, too young to understand anything about him as a person. I had his cabin, I had some photographs, I had his name in one of his suits that was too big for me to wear, and I struggled with questions that I didn't have answers to and that I didn't have anyone to ask. How can a son continue his father's legacy if he's not sure what that legacy should be? How do you become a man when you're not sure what you're supposed to want and what you're supposed to be willing to sacrifice for it? I wasn't sure if every man struggled with being a man or if it was just me. I told Bree none of this, though. Over coffee one night a few weeks later, she was telling me about her mother, and I was nodding my head. There was something different about Bree that night, a sadness that made me want to protect her. As I was thinking this, she stopped and smiled at me, a new smile, one that warmed my face like I was sitting in front of a fire. She took my right hand and placed it on the back of her neck, put my left hand along her cheek. Then she leaned in towards me and stopped right before she touched her face to mine. I leaned in to kiss her and caught the corner of her mouth. She laughed and I felt a bit silly. I licked my lip and tasted her on it. Then I kissed her again, this time on the lips. I don't know where I heard it, but I heard every man will always love his first. I not only loved my first, but I wanted her to be my last. If Robert was right, and my parents' deaths had taught me anything, it was that the devil was always at our door, and his hellhounds were always right on our heels. I realized that spring how quickly and easily you could forget about the things that chase you when you have a woman to hold you, so you can protect each other from the doom. The summer was hot and bright, and for a good 3 months, it left its hot, sticky trail on my skin like a slug. I took to sleeping inside again, which was strange and comforting at the same time. Bree stayed over quite a bit, and when she did, she would wrap her arms around me, and I would dream in a soft black, and never long for the dusty dreams of my past. Bree and I would carouse and scream into the night like we had a grudge. We'd kiss wherever we went and didn't care who was watching, and then we'd wake up and do it again, only we would try to scream louder and kiss harder. On my birthday, Bree and I stumbled out of the railroad station and began walking home. We saw a house whose lights were all off and whose newspapers were scattered across the driveway like dead gray dogs. We cased the house for a little while, wanting to make sure the people weren't home. When we were sure it was safe, I crawled through an unlocked window and opened the front door. She stepped in and we kissed long and hard, like a reunion kiss in the movies. Bree went to find some liquor. I followed, singing Robert Johnson. "Why do you love that guy so much?" Bree asked. I tried to tell her what I had told the turtle with no name, but I don't think it came out right. "Fuck," she said. "Still don't get it." I smiled at her, grabbed her by the arms, and kissed her. Then I sang some more. Bree and I drank and kissed and danced throughout the night. Before we left, Bree stole a fancy sequin top from the woman's closet and convinced me to steal something of the man's. So I stole an old black handkerchief from his dresser, one that I hoped he wouldn't miss. I thought we were crossing some unspoken line between people, but I did it anyway. Before we left, we rearranged the couches and left a note that said only, "We were here."